You know more about living well than you are living. You have read the philosophy, absorbed the frameworks, understood the arguments. You know what equanimity looks like and how it is supposed to be cultivated. You know the Stoic distinction between what is up to you and what is not. You know that virtue is the only good. You know all of this, and you still react when you meant to respond, still defer what matters for what presses, still find in the quiet, honest inventory that the understanding has not fully become the life. Musonius Rufus, the Stoic teacher who taught Epictetus, who was exiled 3 times for his convictions, who was called the Roman Socrates by his contemporaries, said this gap between the known and the lived is not a knowledge problem. It is a practice problem. And the philosophy that addresses it without demanding daily physical practice is not, in his precise and uncomfortable view, philosophy at all. It is entertainment. This is the most demanding and the most neglected insight in the Stoic tradition, and it is the one you probably most need to hear. There is a way of engaging with wisdom that feels like progress and produces very little change. The reading, the note-taking, the thoughtful discussion, the podcast that articulates exactly what you have been sensing but not yet said. Each encounter with the philosophy produces a real response, recognition, illumination, the specific satisfaction of a framework that describes the problem accurately. And then Monday arrives, and the pattern reasserts itself, and the insight that felt transformative on Sunday afternoon has somehow not survived contact with the actual conditions of the actual life. This is not hypocrisy. It is the natural outcome of treating philosophy as intellectual engagement rather than as a regimen, as a thing to understand rather than a thing to do, as knowledge to be accumulated rather than capacity to be trained. Musonius made the training analogy explicit and insisted on it. The person who reads about physical fitness and understands its principles but never exercises is not physically fit. The understanding does not produce the fitness. Only the training produces the fitness. And the person who reads about philosophy and understands its principles but never trains the responses, who never practices the patience in the small moment, the equanimity in the minor frustration, the virtue in the Tuesday afternoon when nobody is watching, is not, by any standard Musonius recognized, a philosopher. They are a person who finds philosophy interesting. The distinction matters enormously because the Stoic promise, the claim that the examined and practiced life produces a specific, reliable, and available under pressure quality of freedom and peace, is a promise about training, not about understanding. And the person who has spent years understanding without training is not closer to the promise than when they started. They are more sophisticated in their description of the distance. Gaius Musonius Rufus was born around 30 AD, probably in Volsini in Etruria, in the region of Italy now known as Tuscany. He was of equestrian rank, a Roman citizen of the class just below the senatorial aristocracy. Almost nothing is known about his early life. What is known is that by the time he appears in the historical record, he has already established himself as one of the most significant philosophical teachers in Rome, sought out by senators, aristocrats, and serious students of philosophy, who recognized in him something that distinguished him sharply from the professional philosophers who decorated the courts of the wealthy.
What distinguished him was the consistency between the philosophy and the life. He was, by every account, a person who practiced what he taught, with a specificity and a seriousness that made the gap between theory and practice visible in everyone around him. He was exiled 3 times. First, under Nero, around 65 AD, sent to the island of Gyaros in the Aegean, an island of such miserable conditions that exile there was considered only slightly preferable to execution. He was eventually recalled and returned to Rome. He was exiled again under Vespasian, recalled again. Under Domitian, he was exiled for a third time. He survived all 3 exiles. He continued teaching. His practice apparently held under exactly the conditions that philosophy promises it will hold, which is the only testimony about a philosophy worth having. His students included Epictetus, who was enslaved at the time, attending the lectures of Musonius with the permission of his owner. The teaching Epictetus received from Musonius became the foundation of the discourses, which became the foundation of Marcus Aurelius's practice, which became the foundation of what we now call Stoicism in its most practically influential form. Without Musonius, the chain does not run. Without the teacher who insisted on practice over theory, the tradition's most practice-oriented thinkers do not develop in the way they developed. His own writings do not survive. What we have are lecture notes taken by his students, most fully preserved in the work of the rhetorician Lucius, who compiled what is now known as the Fragments of Musonius Rufus. These fragments cover an extraordinary range on food, on marriage, on exile, on manual labor, on the education of women, on the relationship between philosophy and daily life. The breadth is itself a philosophical statement. The philosophy that matters is not confined to the seminar room. It is expressed in every meal, every relationship, every physical act of the daily life. His position on women deserves particular notice. He argued in the 1st century AD that women were equally capable of philosophical education and equally required to receive it, that virtue was not gendered and that the philosophical training appropriate for men was equally appropriate for women. This was not the majority view of his century. It was the consistent implication of the philosophy he was teaching, and he followed it where it led. 3 arguments are at the center of Musonius's teaching, and each one is more demanding than it first appears. The first is that philosophy is a training, not a body of knowledge. The Stoics borrowed from medicine the idea of philosophy as therapy, the examined life as a treatment for the diseases of the soul, passion, fear, grief, the disordered desires that produce suffering. But therapy requires not just diagnosis, but treatment, not just understanding the disease, but doing the specific, repeated, sometimes uncomfortable work of treating it. The person who has been diagnosed with a disease and understands it thoroughly but refuses the treatment is not on the path to health. They're on the path to a more sophisticated understanding of their illness. Musonius pushed this analogy further than any other Stoic. He said, the philosophy that does not change behavior is not philosophy, it is rhetoric. And the philosopher who can speak beautifully about virtue without embodying it has accomplished something, but not the thing philosophy is for. The second argument is about the body. This is the part of Musonius that most modern readers find most unexpected and most useful. He argued that physical training is not separate from philosophical training. It is part of it. The person who cannot endure physical discomfort, who has made themselves excessively comfortable, who has trained their body only in ease, has weakened the very instrument that philosophical practice requires. Because the practice of equanimity in difficulty depends on having trained the capacity to endure difficulty. The person who has never voluntarily sat with discomfort has not developed the muscle that will hold under the involuntary discomforts that life will certainly deliver. He prescribed cold, hunger, fatigue, not as ascetic ends in themselves, but as training grounds. The cold shower that is unpleasant, the meal that is simpler than comfort requires, the physical work that the privileged life avoids, not to make life miserable, to develop the specific resilience that the philosophical life, a life lived with genuine virtue under real conditions, including the conditions of exile and loss and the proximity of death, requires.
The third argument is about consistency across contexts. Musonius had no tolerance for the philosopher who practices equanimity in the seminar and loses it at home. The philosophy that works only in favorable conditions is not the philosophy at all. It is the imitation of philosophy under conditions that do not test it. The Stoic training must be brought to the table, to the marriage, to the moment of provocation, to the Tuesday afternoon that feels no different from any other Tuesday. Because the test is not the dramatic moment. The test is whether the practice has been so thoroughly trained that it expresses itself naturally, without effort, without special invocation, in the completely ordinary conditions that constitute most of a life. He said, every day and every hour, either you are practicing philosophy or you are not. There is no neutral position. Every meal, either it trains the discipline of simplicity or it trains the habit of excess. Every provocation, either it trains the response or it deepens the reaction. Every ordinary interaction, either it practices the virtue or it practices the absence of virtue. The choice is always active, always present, always consequential. Now the bridge. Because Musonius was a first-century Roman Stoic teaching to students in person in the specific conditions of Neronian and Flavian Rome, and most people watching this video are not. But here is what has not changed. The philosophy you understand and do not practice. The insight that felt transformative when it arrived and has not survived consistent application to the conditions of the actual life. The morning intention that is a genuine intention and that dissolves by the time the third difficult thing of the day arrives. The gap, specific, personal, honest, between the person who reads about Stoicism on Sunday and the person who responds to the difficult email on Monday. Musonius is not condemning this, he is diagnosing it. The gap is not evidence of inadequacy, it is evidence of insufficient training. And the response to insufficient training is not more understanding, it is the specific, unglamorous, daily physical practice of the virtue that is currently most absent, brought to the actual conditions of the actual life, where it will encounter resistance and fail regularly and be returned to and practiced again. Not dramatically. The cold shower is a cold shower. The simpler meal is a simpler meal. The pause before the reaction is a pause. The philosophy becomes the life, one small practice at a time. And the life becomes the philosophy, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. Here is what Musonius Rufus.
First, identify the gap between what you know and what you practice. Not in general, one specific virtue, the one where the distance between your philosophical understanding and your daily behavior is most visible. Patience, perhaps. You know the arguments, you understand the neuroscience, you have read Seneca on anger, and you still find the reaction moving faster than the intention. Or simplicity, or the present moment focus that the practice keeps promising and the anxious planning keeps preventing. Name the one virtue that is most understood and least practiced, because the practice that Musonius prescribes is specific, not general. You do not practice philosophy in the abstract. You practice patience in this encounter, simplicity in this meal, equanimity in this provocation. Second, train the body alongside the mind. This is the Musonius instruction most foreign to the modern self-improvement context, which tends to treat philosophy as cognitive and the body as a separate domain. Choose one form of voluntary physical discomfort, not punishing, not extreme, that trains the basic capacity to endure what is difficult without requiring it to stop. The cold shower, the early rising when the bed offers resistance, the meal simpler than appetite demands, the walk taken in weather that the comfortable self would have avoided. Do it once today, not as asceticism, as training, the specific Musonius-prescribed development of the resilience that the philosophical practice requires, and that softness gradually erodes. Third, bring the philosophy to the ordinary moment, not to the dramatic test, to Tuesday afternoon, to the meeting that starts behind schedule, to the person whose behavior is reliably provoking, to the meal, the commute, the evening, the ordinary fabric of the ordinary day. This is where the philosophy either lives or doesn't. The dramatic moment comes rarely. The ordinary moment comes constantly. And the person who has practiced the virtue in the ordinary moment arrives at the dramatic one with a trained response rather than an intention. Musonius's whole teaching is organized around this. Philosophy practiced only in favorable conditions is not philosophy. It is rehearsal for a performance that the conditions will eventually prevent.
Fourth, measure the practice, not the understanding. At the end of today, not the week, today, ask the Musonius question. Not, what did I understand? What did I practice? In how many of the day's actual encounters did the philosophical training express itself? Where did the reaction override the response? Where did the discipline hold? Not for self-condemnation, for the honest accounting that Musonius believed was the primary tool of the training. The training that is not measured is not training, it is intention. And intention, without the feedback of honest measurement, accumulates into the comfortable feeling of philosophical progress that has not actually occurred. I want to close with the image that stays with me when I think about Musonius on the island of Gyaros, the most miserable exile location in the Roman world. The island where prisoners were sent as a form of prolonged punishment, where the conditions were designed to break the person's connection to the comfortable life they had known. He was not broken, not because he had the right thoughts about exile, because he had trained for it. Every voluntary discomfort in the years before the exile had been, in some sense, preparation for the involuntary discomfort of Gyaros. The philosophy had been practiced in the easy times, in the ordinary times, in the Tuesday afternoons, and so it held in the extraordinary time. That is what training is for. Not the normal. The normal requires very little. The training is for the moment that the normal is not available, when the provocation is real, the discomfort is serious, the patience is genuinely costly. In those moments, you have what you trained, not what you understood. He survived 3 exiles. He returned to teaching each time. The philosophy held. And the holding, the specific, reliable, available under pressure holding, was the proof of the training, not the argument, the life. Here is the question Musonius leaves us with today. Name the virtue you most understand and least practice. And name one specific, ordinary, unglamorous thing you could do today, not to understand it better, but to train it. One cold shower, one simpler meal, one pause before the reaction, one honest accounting at day's end. Leave that in the comments, because the naming of the practice, not the philosophy, the practice, is the beginning of the training that Musonius said was the only kind of philosophy worth the name. I'll see you in the next one.